Hi everyone. I wanted to talk something that's interesting to me, and it's a little on the technical side, but I hope it makes some sense. Which is what what an app manager might look like for AEC, and this is certainly in the context of um, as we scroll down, and I'll get back to it. Sort of the notion of what an IDE might look like for AEC, and it's a little. We have to come up with a better term for that. Please sort of poke at me at some social messaging platform if you care about it, a name for something like this or what you think it is. But what I wanted to do is just talk through quickly, sort of if you go down that path, what sort of things do you want to sort of think about when you are doing tooling? And the first thing that comes to mind for me is sort of how you think about packages and containers. So just a little bit of primer. This is not meant to be a technical explanation of these topics. I'll keep it pretty high level, but in the software development world, there are package managers that make it easy to deploy pieces of software that get used in building other software. So in the web world, so the two most popular ones, this is in the JSON space, basically, these are NPM, so Node Package Manager, and Yarn Package Manager. So basically what these are interfaces you can go to and sort of talk to as a software developer and get updates. Or if you're in the Python world, pip, every sort of language has one of these. Rust has the cargo app manager, and I think each one of these are containers, I think, in their parlance. But the point is, sort of software gets built this way. It does have some challenges. A lot of the challenges come from the fact that a lot of people sort of just directly reference these things, and as updates are posted, they cause some problems, especially if somebody's taken control of a package and got into the put some bad code in that package. So that's sometimes called a supply chain hack. But anyway, we'll get into this. And then on the Linux world, and it's becoming more popular in the Windows space and the Mac space, but certainly there's these notions of package managers, which are basically full apps. So these are examples of software. These are full apps, but both are really to say there's a bunch of tools you want to deploy, make them easy to use, and a package manager or an app store, or a good example, Snap is one of the examples. But the point is that these really help and make it easy to deploy things. And then the other thing to just talk about is containerization. I use the term, but if you're a software developer, it means something very specific. I just think it basically means separating things into smaller pieces. But the term in the sort of server hardware space is basically you have a computer and there's a couple technologies, one Docker and one Kubernetes, that are not necessarily competitors but built for different purposes, and sort of but basically what they are is, instead of having to, if you will, virtualize a whole computer if you wanted to deploy an app, what you actually can do is just package up just what the applications need. This is a super simplified way of looking at it, but just the comparison is like you can get a lot more resources because you're doing a lot less versus a virtual computer. And these are sort of very fundamental ways to think about them, but it's basically like putting a bunch of stuff inside of each one of these, whereas a virtual computer is sort of, you can't get as much of stuff. The reason I bring it up in the context of our world is you might say an app that only can be configured one way on your computer is quasi like a virtual computer, whereas if apps can be configured per one of these instances, so if an app can be in this one, it can be looking different than that one. And that's this idea of containerization. So for me, when I'm thinking about this, and I make comparisons between software development world all the time because there's a ton of things. The things you need to think about is, like, all projects are different, just like software development. I think we need to have better supply chain security. So if you're working on projects, and this shouldn't be an end user issue certainly, but it just should be something we have a little bit more control on, because we want to sort of control things. Enable project level version branch upgrades, so you could have different versions of different apps. Like if you have a long running project and you need things to be consistent, this is why you'd start to think about sort of separating them out, containerizing them. So you sort of can decide like, oh, on this project we're not going to upgrade this thing. Maybe you do from a security purpose, but sort of unless something's wrong, you never upgrade it. Maybe certainly want to support offline delivery and offline apps. So the idea that you can sort of work offline and deploy offline. So if you work on a secure project or can't be stored in the cloud, you need to deliver both the apps and think about how you configure where the data goes. And then the logic I'm going to show in the context of an IDE, but if you're using other apps who sort of want to think about, I want to deploy the project environment. And I said, as an example, VS Code. So Visual Studio Code is a reference because it does something like this. Each sort of development project is its own little world. How do we do something like that? So just to make sure we're summarizing a little bit what I was talking about in the IDE. So IDE is Integrated Development Environment. There's a lot of sort of different words for this, but like, again, I don't like the term. Somebody suggest a new one. But it's basically this idea in my mind that all of our sort of data is actually very interconnected. And so if we want to think about how to modernize an industry, you have to sort of bring it together like the software development world. So you might be familiar with code editor is the name for this. So a similar idea, but basically the sort of logic here is like if you're going to look at material list and specification and actually make sure those two are aligned, what you're really doing is you're sort of putting these two apps or extensions, I think is the way to maybe think about them, next to each other. And then you're going to reference some data, and it can actually reference the same data. But what you're doing is that sort of this model is one that's sort of repeated all the time in our industry. If you're going to do a code review, do I have things in the code that affect my specifications or materials, what have you. So this is just a very sort of high-level view of things. So just to show exactly that thing is like the idea that if I'm working across these things and want to keep them into sync, the big idea is that you put them next to each other, but the sort of more nuanced version of that, and I think more long-term powerful, is actually what you're doing is making links between data sets. So if these things ever change in the future or get updated, what you're doing is building the map to revisit change. So I know that sort of this piece of data is actually related to the spec section. So if this changed, it potentially might mean I need to revisit this. So early on when I started looking at this problem, I said, can you answer a change question? That's at the very end of a process. And I don't have the slides in this deck, but basically it's like 20 different places you want to have stitched together so you could at least rebuild the map. You don't necessarily have to automatically know if it's going to prove that you have to change anything, but this is a thing you sort of really want to think about. And this is a spec app or spec extension. Maybe think is a better way to think about it, depending on how software developers eventually think about these. But these are just separate things that come together, and they live in this ecosystem, or a sort of a visualization review with that same material list. Again, two separate apps extensions, but the point is that you're in the context of a project, you're bringing this information together, and you can set them side by side and make meaningful tools that help really extend a person's sort of ability to get work done easily and sort of manage change as you go forward. So that's the context. There's tons of these. Each one of those apps, IDEs, is going to reference different data sets, but the data sets don't belong to the app. They're just sort of independent. And then really when you get to the next stage here, it's like, okay, what does an app and extension manager really look like in our industry? So the first thing is that there's a little bit more information that's sort of web-based than there is project-based. So you start out with this extension manager library. So let's say I have two extensions. And first thing you do is sort of, okay, I make the project-specific container. This is slightly different than the development world because this concept isn't sort of, at least from where I could tell, prevalent in the software development world. What you do is you you start building the tools, and then you make the description in the tooling, and then everybody that gets added to a project, you'd have the recipe in the software, like YAML files or something like that, to say, oh, go get this version of this piece of software. That's not how we want to work, I don't think, in the AEC space, where you just want your staff and end users to really just be able to sort of start a project, join a project. When joining it, they get the right stuff. But what you want to be able to do here is maybe do things like, sort of host it yourself. Sort of this orange layer is the beginnings of the container. Sort of I want to admin these online, like I said. So you want to be able to think about adminning to manage across across multiple firms, especially in a collaborative sense, like, okay, who's hosting the blank on this project, or can I have more than one container be used in the project context? Probably, or some version of that. Sort of templates, oh, we're doing this kind of interiors project, so here's the interior tools, here's the spec tool for interiors, what have you. And then if you think about it, it would be the right time to configure things like, oh, well, what web services are each one of these apps going to talk to? Because I'm super super behind the idea that this sort of stuff should be independent of the infrastructure it runs on. Because if you needed to run it privately offline, you need to be able to run it offline. If you need to run it in an enterprise environment that you sort of back it with NoSQL or SQL databases, sure. Is it a shared web service across the company? Is it used on are you using a web service that you have, but not the one that you host, but another company's? All these things I think are important. So when you have the project container, what you're doing is you're actually adding an extension. The way I think about this, and I'm not a software developer, is like the first thing we'd want to do is institute some security here. So you sort of maybe do something like adding hashes to say, in the context of this container, this app is hashed. So it, sort of the admin level, you set that bit of information. So the point here of a hash is just it's a way of making something identifiable that is hard to reverse engineer. So if I have this big long hash, I can't easily figure out what the input value was. So like project number 5555 or something like that doesn't really matter. But the point is, this becomes a unique version of this extension that's referenced into the container. So then if you have, sort of a one project one container, and that extension, that's what I get. If I have the second one, another one, I have a different version. So the point of thinking about this is like you can actually validate apps to a specific project. So like the idea that you should be running this thing, and this works with this thing. There's ways of thinking about this for licensing, if there's sort of different mechanisms to getting access to licensing. And then you certainly have to think about, like, if this is just an environment that you can add anything you want to protect against running arbitrary code. So if these extensions are hashed, then you can't run a non-hashed sort of extension on this project at all, but one that doesn't match this project, with the whole point being really putting up some real strong safeguards to make this really configurable, deployable, but also sort of putting up the barriers to make it really quite safe as you can from the beginning. And then that should be safeguard, not guard, against unwanted project application use. So maybe you don't want, for whatever reason, I don't care, you want to restrict the applications can be used. This would certainly be a way to do it. And then finally, you should be able to sort of package all these things up in such that, okay, you can add a project without ever having access to this sort of web management portal and provide updates. And this could even include, let's say it really has to be an offline use or something like that. It could actually include the local storage sort of setups or something like that. That's it. Sort of an interesting one. I did, sort of just wanted to start a pattern of getting through things. This was a relatively short one to talk about. As I look ahead, I started to develop a list of things that I'm sort of thinking about talking about. This is not legible, but like, sort of let's get more into how the IDE works, or sort of anything. Um, um, does anything in here I'm talking about work with Web3? This is actually a Web3 tool. I've been a fan of some of the web technologies before it got, if you will, polluted in my mind with um, NFT stuff. So this is actually a program called AnyType that does very similar things to Notion. And the point is but it's actually built on a serverless infrastructure, so it's decentralized. So that's interesting to me in a lot of ways. But again, this is the list. It's will grow and change. It's not meant to be that these are intelligible. But my point is, in the coming weeks, I'll start to think about adding more stuff. That's it for today. Thank you.